Waiters, what's the most ridiculous order a customer ever makes? Story 1. I work as a server at a high-end restaurant, and while I've had my fair share of odd requests, this one takes the cake. A couple came in for a romantic dinner, and everything seemed fine at first. They ordered a bottle of wine and some appetizers. When it came time for the main course, the man started with an unusual request. He asked for a steak, medium rare, but here's where it got weird. He then requested that it be cooked without any heat. He insisted that he just wanted it to rest on the grill long enough for the flavor to soak in, but not enough for it to be cooked. I tried to explain that a medium rare steak requires cooking, but he was adamant that I simply let it warm up on the grill without any heat actually cooking it. He wanted the flavor and texture of a steak, but without it being contaminated by actual cooking. After a lengthy back and forth with the chef, we ended up serving him a raw steak, and he seemed delighted. The weirdest part was that his partner was perfectly fine with this. He ate the steak with such satisfaction, like it was some kind of culinary enlightenment. At the end of the night, he tipped 20%, but I still can't wrap my head around how someone could want a steak cooked without it actually being cooked. Story 2. I work as a server at a chain restaurant, and let me tell you, the requests I get are something else. One evening, a woman came in alone, ordered a salad, and when I brought it to her, she immediately asked me to douse it in ranch dressing. But no actual ranch. I thought she was joking. So I asked her to clarify, and she said, just put all the ranch flavors in it. You know, the vibe of ranch without the ranch dressing itself. Can you do that? I honestly didn't know how to respond. I stood there for a second, trying to make sense of what she was asking for. I told her I could bring her ranch dressing on the side, but she refused. No dressing, just the taste. Like a ranch-inspired experience. So I went back to the kitchen, told the chef, and we came up with something, a mix of garlic powder, parsley, and some other spices that sort of mimicked the taste of ranch. When I brought it back, she tasted it and said, close enough, but maybe a bit more garlic. I thought it was the weirdest thing ever, but at least she seemed satisfied. It's safe to say I've never had a request quite like that. Story 3. I was working a busy shift on a Friday night when a table of 3 sat down. They looked like a nice group, 2 adults and a teenager. The mom ordered a basic salad, the dad got a steak, and the teen ordered a burger with a twist. The burger was to be made entirely out of bread, with no beef patty at all. I was puzzled, but went along with it and asked if they wanted something else in place of the beef, like a veggie patty or grilled chicken. They said no, just bread. So I took the order to the kitchen, and the chef was equally baffled but agreed to make a burger with just 2 buns, lettuce, tomato, and some condiments, all in a burger. I brought it out to the table, and the teenager was thrilled. He took a bite and said, "Perfect. This is exactly what I wanted." The oddest part was when I came back later to check in. The dad said, "I guess I should have ordered one of those too, huh? My steak's too complicated now." I don't know if it was a joke, but it was definitely one of the weirdest orders I've had. A bread-only burger. Why not? Story 4. I've worked as a waiter for years, but there's one story that still blows my mind. A customer came in during brunch looking extremely serious and ordered the most complicated breakfast I've ever encountered. She asked for eggs, but only egg whites, scrambled in coconut oil, served on a plate that had been pre-warmed to exactly 115 degrees Fahrenheit. She insisted that I serve the dish on a certain type of ceramic plate that she brought with her. Not only that, but she also wanted the eggs to be served on top of a piece of toast. But the toast had to be gluten-free, dairy-free, and spiritually neutral. I'm not sure what spiritually neutral meant, but I just smiled and nodded. I took the order to the kitchen, and the chef and I had to improvise to get everything just right. We made the eggs with coconut oil, toasted the gluten-free bread, and served it on her personal plate. I brought it out, and she immediately inspected everything under a magnifying glass. The worst part? She said the eggs were not the right shade of yellow and refused to eat them, demanding a full refund. When I told her that the eggs had already been cooked, she muttered something about how the vibes were off and left without eating a single bite. Story 5. A customer came into our restaurant late one evening and made an extremely specific request. She wanted her dessert, but she didn't want it to be too sweet, and didn't want any taste of chocolate, caramel, or vanilla. Okay, fair enough. But she also specified that the dessert had to be made with no dairy or gluten, and it couldn't be too moist or too dry. At this point, I wasn't sure what she was hoping for, but I walked back to the kitchen where we tried our best to create a dessert that would match her vision. We ended up making a lemon sorbet, which seemed like a safe bet given the no sweet request. But when I brought it to her, she scrutinized it intensely before asking, "Is there any sugar in this?" "I can taste sugar. I need you to take it back and try again." I wasn't sure what she was even asking for anymore. It turned out she didn't like the taste of sugar, even in lemon sorbet, which is naturally sweetened. After what seemed like an hour of back and forth, we ended up giving her a plate of fresh fruit as her dessert. She didn't say a word, just nodded with approval as if everything was finally in alignment. At least she didn't leave a bad tip. But I'll never understand how someone could be so particular about dessert. Story 6. I've been working as a server at a family-owned Italian restaurant for a few years now, and you'd think by now I've seen it all. But there's one order that I'll never forget. A man came in one afternoon, alone, and sat at the bar. He ordered a glass of red wine and a small Caesar salad to start, which seemed normal enough. But when he placed his main order, that's when things got strange. He asked for a bowl of spaghetti with marinara sauce, but not regular marinara sauce. He requested that it be made from scratch, even though we were already serving the sauce from the kitchen, which was made fresh daily. He explained, I want the marinara sauce to be a blend of tomatoes, but not too much acidity. I don't want it to taste too tangy, but I need it to have a slight sweetness. I assured him our sauce was made with just the right balance of sweetness and acidity, but he wasn't convinced. He insisted that it be recreated using the tomatoes he had brought with him. A mixture of 3 different types of heirloom tomatoes he claimed were the only tomatoes that would work. At this point, I'm starting to question reality, but I agreed to take the tomatoes back to the chef. After some eye rolls and smirks in the kitchen, we agreed to make the sauce using his tomatoes, but with a few tweaks to get it close to what we already served. When I brought the dish to him, he immediately tasted it, frowned, and said, it's almost there, but it's not quite perfect. Do you have any brown sugar? I handed him a packet of sugar, which he took and added to his pasta. Then he paused and told me, you know what? It's better, but still not right. I'll just finish this off, but I'd prefer it if you didn't charge me for the meal. I didn't get the flavor I was looking. He didn't leave a tip either. The most bizarre part? He actually came back the following week with a new batch of tomatoes, asking for the same thing. Some people just have a very specific idea of what they want. Story 7. Working at a diner can be a real trip sometimes, especially when you get customers with requests that make you double-check your ears. One Sunday morning, a woman walked in and sat down with her husband. They were both in their mid-40s, looking like a typical couple. She ordered a breakfast plate with eggs, bacon, toast, and hash browns. Standard order. But when I asked how she'd like her eggs, she went into a long, detailed explanation that I can still remember clearly to this day. I need my eggs scrambled, but not too scrambled. They can't be dry, but they can't be runny either. I want them fluffy, but not too fluffy. Think of it like a pillow. It needs to have the softness of a cloud, but with a slight firmness that makes them feel grounded, you know? I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. And she added, and can you ask the cook to add a pinch of paprika and a tiny splash of heavy cream? I think that'll give it the right balance. I nodded, trying to hide my confusion. When I brought the eggs to the table, she immediately inspected them, poking the edges with her fork before shaking her head. These aren't fluffy enough. You need to tell your cook they didn't get the cloud-like texture I was going for. She even asked if I could bring in a new plate of eggs, scrambled exactly like the last batch, but with more air inside them. I returned to the kitchen and relayed the message. The chef looked at me like I was joking, but after much deliberation, we made another batch, which I brought to her. This time, she took a bite and smiled. This is better. I'll eat it, but I think I'll need a little more paprika. I went back to the kitchen and returned with the smallest dash of paprika you could possibly imagine. Perfect, she said, and that was the last I heard of it. No complaints about the bacon, toast, or hash browns. Just those eggs with the perfect amount of fluffiness. She left a generous tip, but I still can't quite figure out how one person can have such a precise, borderline poetic vision for scrambled eggs. Story 8. I was working at a steakhouse during a particularly busy Friday night when a couple walked in and ordered a variety of items. The woman, in particular, was very specific about her food preferences. She ordered a filet mignon, but it had to be only cooked in olive oil with no salt or pepper, which is already an odd request in itself. But then she started getting even more detailed. I want the filet to be cooked on the grill, but only one side should face the heat for exactly 3 minutes and 12 seconds, she said, looking very serious. After that, flip it and cook the other side for exactly 2 minutes and 47 seconds. And when it's done, don't let it rest for more than 10 seconds before serving it to me. I tried to explain that steaks usually require a bit of resting time, but she was insistent. I brought the request to the kitchen and we did our best to follow the timeline she set out. The steak was flipped precisely at 3 minutes and 12 seconds, cooked for the additional time, and served immediately. When I brought it to her, she picked up her fork, cut into the steak, and immediately took a bite. She paused for what seemed like an eternity, then finally said, "It's a little overcooked. Can you take it back and redo the second flip? It's not quite as tender as I like it." The chef was understandably frustrated, but we gave it another shot. After what felt like an entire lifetime of wait times, she ate the second steak and smiled. That's more like it. Thank you. I couldn't believe it when she left an astronomical tip. But I've never seen anyone so particular about their steak in my entire life. It's a good thing the restaurant is known for accommodating crazy requests because she sure made us work for that tip. Story 9. I work at a small coffee shop in a touristy part of town, and the types of requests I get can sometimes be out there. One morning, a woman came in with her 2 young children and ordered a spiced latte. Nothing unusual so far. But when I started preparing the drink, she asked me to make sure there were exactly 27 pumpkin seeds in the foam. At first, I thought she was joking, but she gave me a serious look. I need them distributed evenly throughout the foam, with no seeds left in the coffee itself, she explained, and I need it to be symmetrical. It's very important for my mood today. I had to ask the kitchen staff for the pumpkin seeds and carefully place them in the foam, just as she instructed. I brought it to her, and she immediately began inspecting it, as though she were an artist examining a masterpiece. She counted each seed, then nodded in approval. Perfect, she said, and she sat back to enjoy her latte. The weirdest part was that she asked if I could also balance the energy in her coffee by arranging the seeds in a specific direction, claiming it would align her aura for the rest of the day. I couldn't make this up if I tried. Story 10. I had a customer once who asked for a plate of fries. Nothing special, right? Well, as I'm about to take the order, she added, but I don't want regular fries. I want sweet potato fries, but I need them to be made from organic sweet potatoes that were harvested only during a full moon. I froze for a second. I tried to explain that we couldn't control the moon cycles or the harvest schedule of the sweet potatoes, but she was firm. She went on to explain that if the potatoes were harvested under a new moon or any other phase, they wouldn't have the correct cosmic energy to produce the right taste. After much back and forth, I finally agreed to bring her regular sweet potato fries and told her I'd do my best to match the moon energy for her. When the fries arrived, she carefully examined each one before sighing deeply and saying, "They're not quite right. I can feel the imbalance." To this day, I still don't understand how anyone could be so particular about fries. What baffles me more is that she left a massive tip and promised she'd return, though I haven't seen her since. Story 11. I work as a server at a fairly busy bistro that specializes in upscale comfort food. One night, a woman came in with her friend, and they ordered drinks and some appetizers, which went fine. When it came time for their main course, the woman started to make a very peculiar request. She wanted the chicken breast grilled, but it had to be grilled with no flame, and she insisted that the chicken never come into direct contact with the grill. I thought I'd misheard, so I asked her to clarify. I want it cooked gently, maybe just on the side of the grill, where it's warm, but no actual flames should touch the chicken. The grill marks will ruin the texture. I'm trying to keep it as untouched by fire as possible, she said seriously. I was dumbfounded, but I took the order back to the kitchen. The chef was equally perplexed but tried his best to accommodate. We ended up cooking the chicken in an indirect heat area, using the residual warmth from the grill without any direct flame contact. When I brought it out, she was inspecting it with a magnifying glass, trying to make sure there were no scorch marks. I stood there for a minute, waiting for feedback. After what seemed like an eternity, she nodded approving. "It's perfect," she said. "Not a single flame touch. This is exactly what I wanted. Can I also get the chicken cut into 7 pieces? I don't know if it was the weirdest order I'd ever taken, but it was certainly one of the most specific. She finished her meal, paid, and left a decent tip, but the whole experience left me baffled. It's not often you get someone so insistent on having food untouched by fire. Story 12. It was an average Thursday when I had one of the most surreal experiences I've had in my years of waiting tables. A couple came in for a late lunch. They were friendly at first, but once they started ordering, things went downhill quick. The man ordered a burger, but he didn't want a regular bun. He wanted it served in an edible shell of organic seaweed. Okay, I thought, it's odd, but it's a special dietary request, so I took it to the chef. Next, the woman ordered a salad, but not just any salad. She wanted a mixture of only 5 specific vegetables: kale, cucumber, avocado, sweet potato, and beets. It had to be chopped into perfect cubes, and then sprinkled with exactly 17 chia seeds. But the real kicker came when she asked for a dressing, only it had to be made from the essence of a single ripe lemon and served on the side in a separate glass vial. The chef was clearly a little frustrated by these demands, but we tried to get everything just right. When I brought out the burger, the man frowned immediately. "The seaweed shell is too dark," he said. "I wanted it lighter, more translucent." I apologized and brought it back to the kitchen for adjustments. Meanwhile, the woman was examining her salad with an intensity I hadn't seen before. She picked up the dressing and took a tiny sip, then shook her head. "This doesn't have the same freshness as the last one I had." Can you ask the chef to blend it with a bit of organic, freshly hand-squeezed lemon juice from the tree outside? I was in disbelief at this point, but agreed. After about an hour of waiting and adjustments, they finally seemed happy with their meal. As they left, they complimented the staff for their patience and dedication to the craft, and then they vanished into the evening. They left a generous tip, but I still have no idea what just happened. Story 13. One evening, I was working at a restaurant known for its seafood, and a party of 4 came in. They were tourists from another country, and from the moment they sat down, they began asking for some very specific requests. The woman at the table, a mother, ordered a lobster tail, but she had one very specific condition. She didn't want the lobster to be cooked in the usual way, boiled or grilled. She wanted it steamed only with a dash of raw lemon juice, and it had to be served in a way that the lobster maintains its original shape. That wasn't all. She insisted that the lobster should not be separated from its shell, not even partially. The shell must remain as a symbol of its natural state. I cannot eat it unless it's whole, she explained. Her son, meanwhile, was asking for a plate of fried clams but without the clam batter. I just want the clams to be lightly brushed with olive oil and then sautéed in a pan, but no breading. Clams should be as free as possible, he insisted. The chef and I exchanged confused glances, but we did our best to follow the instructions. When the lobster was brought to the table, the woman scrutinized it. "This isn't the right shape," she said, as she picked at the tail. "Can you ask the kitchen to steam it longer until it's completely rigid?" I went back to the kitchen, and after several minutes of trying to steam it to her satisfaction, we finally presented it to her again. This time, she took a bite, nodded, and said, "Better, but I think it could have been more natural." She ended up finishing her meal, but didn't seem completely satisfied. As she left, she told me she would only come back if the lobster was steamed to the exact specifications next time. I guess it was an experience, but it definitely wasn't the most relaxing shift. Story 14. I work at a popular brunch spot, and it's not unusual for customers to have all sorts of dietary restrictions or quirks. But there was one time when a customer made a request that still makes me laugh when I think back on it. A woman came in with a friend, and she ordered Eggs Benedict. But she didn't want the traditional Eggs Benedict. She asked for Eggs Benedict, but with the hollandaise sauce completely omitted. "Okay, no sauce," I said, and started to walk away. But she stopped me and said, "Wait, no. The sauce can't be missing. It has to be there in spirit, though. I need it to feel like it's there." I wasn't sure what she meant, so I asked her to elaborate. She explained that she wanted the eggs in the poached egg to still have the essence of hollandaise sauce, without the actual sauce itself. "Could you maybe just sprinkle some dried thyme on top to capture the vibe of hollandaise?" she asked. I had no idea what to say to that, so I agreed and went back to the kitchen. I told the chef the request, and we came up with a solution: a bit of fresh thyme and some melted butter drizzled on the eggs to capture the hollandaise essence, without actually using it. When I brought it out to her, she smiled, took a bite, and nodded with approval. "Perfect," she said. "I can feel the hollandaise energy, but it's not overwhelming." I was completely dumbfounded, but I gave her credit for sticking to her vision. They finished their meal, and she left a very generous tip. Story 15. I work in a fast casual restaurant where we offer a build-your-own-burger option, so we get a lot of creative orders. But this one customer completely took the cake. A guy came in alone and sat at the counter. He ordered a burger with no bun. Again, not unusual. But he didn't want the patty made from any normal meat. Instead, he insisted on a fusion patty made from a blend of grass-fed beef, lentils, and quinoa. Not only that, but he said, "Make sure the patty is only cooked halfway. I want it medium rare but with no heat." I was baffled by this, so I clarified. "So you want the patty raw but with a crisp exterior?" He nodded seriously. "Exactly. I want it warm on the outside but still raw in the middle." The chef wasn't sure how to handle that one either, but agreed to give it a try. We made the fusion patty, and after a few tries, we managed to get it just right. But then, the man asked for it to be served with a tiny drizzle of freshly pressed olive oil and a pinch of Himalayan pink salt. He added, "Not too much, though. I don't want the salt to overpower the umami of the beef." I was starting to lose track of the complexity of the request. But finally, we had everything together. I brought it out to him, and he took a bite. He chewed for a moment and said, "It's not quite as tender as I imagined. Can you bring it back and use a bit more quinoa next time? I want the texture to be more porous, like a sponge." I just smiled and nodded, but I couldn't believe how far he was going with a burger. At the end of the meal, he paid without much fuss but left a tip that was surprisingly generous for all the extra work involved. Story 16. I work at a trendy cafe that prides itself on being eco-conscious, which means we often have customers with specific dietary needs. But one afternoon, a customer came in and requested the strangest thing I've ever encountered. A woman about in her 50s came up to the counter and asked if we could make her a custom smoothie, but with a very particular set of instructions. She wanted a smoothie made from 3 types of tropical fruit, but she specified that the fruit had to be harvested on the first day of the full moon that month. I had to ask her to repeat herself. She explained that only fruit harvested on that day would have the right cosmic energy to blend into a smoothie that could align her chakras. She went on to say that the fruit should not be refrigerated, as that would negatively impact its energetic properties. She had clearly done her research, or perhaps was taking advice from some obscure source. At this point, I was just trying to figure out how I was going to handle this. I informed her that we didn't keep track of the lunar harvest cycles of our suppliers, and she seemed disappointed but didn't give up. She asked if I could blend together some tropical fruit, but this time she needed a very specific fruit fusion ratio. 1 part mango, 1 part papaya, and 1 part passion fruit, with the mango being the most dominant in taste, but not too sweet. I thought this was already bizarre enough, but she continued. She didn't want any citrus-related bitterness, and requested that the texture of the smoothie remain almost like a sorbet but with a tiny hint of ice crystals left. With no way of following the moon-based instruction, I gave her a blend of mango, papaya, and passion fruit, adjusted to her taste. She looked it over and after several minutes of thoughtful silence said, "It's almost perfect, but it's not quite moisturizing enough. Can you add a couple of ice cubes from your ice machine, but make sure they're not touching the smoothie?" I returned with the cubes and made sure they weren't anywhere near the drink itself, as she had requested. After tasting it, she was satisfied, and I ended up with a 25% tip for my trouble. As strange as it was, I can't deny that the smoothie ended up being quite delicious, even if I have no idea if it truly aligned her chakras. Story 17. I work at a small family-owned pizzeria, and the requests I get from customers can be a little odd. But one evening I had an order that left me speechless. A woman came in with a man, and they both appeared very refined, dressed in business attire. When it came time to order, the woman ordered a large pizza with the strangest list of modifications I've ever heard. She wanted a pizza with half of it completely plain, which seemed normal enough. But then she requested that the other half be topped with a blend of organic heirloom tomatoes and a variety of mushrooms that are absolutely in season. Fine. But the kicker came when she said she wanted no cheese whatsoever. When I asked if she wanted it cheeseless for dietary reasons, she explained, "No, I simply don't want the cheese to interfere with the tomato's natural flavor. The mushrooms, too, need to remain unhindered by any dairy." I nodded, though internally I was baffled. Then she added, "And for the plain half, can you please make sure the crust is extra crispy, but only around the outer rim, not the center? The center should stay soft and chewy, almost like it was baked in a wood oven without any direct flame touching." I relayed the request to the chef, and while he was a little thrown off, he tried his best to fulfill the order. When the pizza arrived, she looked it over, inspecting each piece with the intensity of a food critic. She took a bite of the plain half, then said, "The crust is almost there, but it's too dry. Can you get me a side of olive oil to dip it in? The oil needs to be very light with no overpowering flavor." I brought her a small dish of olive oil and she nodded in approval after dipping her pizza. As she ate, she sighed with satisfaction. When the meal ended, she tipped generously and told me she would be back when the stars align. I don't know if that's a food critique or just her way of saying she liked it, but I'll never forget that pizza order. Story 18. I work at a high-end steakhouse where we pride ourselves on making every guest feel special, but sometimes customers' requests go far beyond the usual. One evening, a businessman came in, dressed in a sharp suit. He ordered the filet mignon, but then came the unusual part. He wanted the steak as rare as possible. I clarified, asking if he meant rare in terms of temperature, and he replied, "No, I mean rare in terms of the experience. I want it served in a way that honors the primal nature of beef." I had no idea what he meant, but I said I'd relay the request to the chef. When I brought the order to the kitchen, the chef and I were stumped. How could we serve something primal without it seeming strange? We decided to serve the steak undercooked to the point of being closer to raw, but we had to keep the customer's request in mind. We seared the steak very lightly, ensuring it didn't lose its natural texture. When I brought the steak out, the man examined it as though it were an ancient artifact. He picked up his fork and gently cut into the steak, taking a very small bite. He nodded with satisfaction but added, "It's almost perfect, but can you bring me a slice of raw onion and a spoonful of mustard on the side? The mustard needs to be tangy, not sweet, and the onion should be sharp." I was still in shock but agreed. When I returned with the mustard and onion, he was more than happy. He ate with such a serene look on his face that I almost wondered if he had reached some spiritual level of appreciation for the steak. After finishing his meal, he left me a generous tip and quietly mentioned, "I'll be back, but next time, I'll want the steak served with a slice of moonstone underneath it. I'm still trying to figure out what that means. Story 19. I was working the lunch shift at a cafe when a customer ordered a cup of soup. But it wasn't just any soup. The woman asked for a tomato bisque, but with one important twist. She didn't want it to have any tomato flavor. In fact, she didn't want to taste any tomato at all, and she was very insistent. I explained that our bisque was made with fresh tomatoes, but she firmly stated that it needed to be made with only the essence of tomato. She didn't want it to have any solid pieces or anything too chunky, and definitely no noticeable tomato pulp. I told the chef about the request, and we tried to find a way to make it work. We decided to use a puree with a smooth texture, along with a touch of basil to bring out the essence of tomato without it being too overt. After blending everything to perfection, we brought it out to her, and she immediately took a sip. She furrowed her brow and said, "This is too bold. The essence is too strong, but the flavor is still too tomatoey. Could you blend it with some fresh coconut water to make it smoother?" We tried again, adding just a tiny bit of coconut water to create a milder, creamier texture. When I brought it back to her, she took a cautious sip, then smiled. "Much better? It's almost like tomato soup, but it doesn't really taste like tomato." She then proceeded to ask for a side of grilled bread, but said it had to be grilled in silence and not disturbed by any sound while cooking. I wasn't sure how to respond, so I just let the chef handle it. Story 20. One Friday night, I had a couple come in for a late dinner, and the man ordered a steak, asking for it to be grilled, but with absolutely no char marks. I thought that was odd, but people can have preferences, so I noted it down. He also asked for his steak to be cooked in olive oil, exclusively, but not just any olive oil. He wanted it to be a special, rare oil from a specific region in Spain. He even brought a bottle of it with him to prove its authenticity. At first, I was taken aback, but I took it to the chef, who agreed to use it. The weirdness didn't stop there, though. The man went on to specify that the steak should be cooked only over low heat, but without any direct contact with the flame. The chef was completely baffled, but we tried to comply, keeping the steak in an indirect heat zone on the grill. When I brought it out, the man picked it up and, before even tasting it, held it up to the light. "There's a slight variance in the color," he said. "It's too dark on the bottom. I need it to be a more even shade of brown." I went back to the kitchen, where we adjusted the grill placement and cooked it again to his satisfaction. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he took a bite, smiled, and said, "It's perfect." As he finished his meal, he complimented the chef and left a hefty tip. But I couldn't help but think that no matter how good the steak was, I had never met someone who cared so much about the exact shade of their steak. Story 21. I work as a server at a small but very popular cafe in a bustling part of town. We get all sorts of customers, but there's one order I'll never forget. It was a typical Saturday morning and the cafe was packed. A woman walked in, with a very serious expression on her face, and ordered a cappuccino. But this wasn't just any cappuccino. She asked for it to be served in a glass mug, but with a very particular temperature. "I need the foam to be exactly 2.7 centimeters thick," she said, looking at me with the intensity of someone giving instructions for a scientific experiment. "And the temperature of the milk should be 63.5 degrees Celsius. No more, no less." I blinked and made sure I heard her right. She continued, "Please make sure the milk is steamed to the right consistency so that the foam doesn't collapse when it hits the coffee. It needs to stay firm like a pillow, but not too stiff. I also want the coffee itself to be poured in a way that creates a swirl pattern without disturbing the foam." I tried to maintain composure as I walked back to the barista. She asked me if I could feel the energy of the coffee. When I asked her to clarify, she explained that she only drank coffee made from beans that had been blessed by the sound of jazz music, which I later learned was a reference to the coffee brand's unique marketing campaign. After carefully preparing her cappuccino to these specifications, I brought it to her, and she took a sip immediately, then paused. "It's good," she said, "but you forgot to make it feel more meditative. Maybe next time try to make the pour a bit slower so the essence of the coffee can fully manifest." She left a huge tip, but I was left completely confused. I'll never look at a cappuccino the same way again. Story 22. I had just finished working a 10-hour shift at an upscale vegetarian restaurant when a couple came in, looking like they were celebrating something special. They ordered a variety of dishes, including the chef's signature pasta. But when they ordered dessert, things took a strange turn. The woman, who was very meticulous in her speech, asked for a chocolate cake, but not just any chocolate cake. She insisted that it be made with a specific type of cacao bean sourced from a farm located in the highlands of Ecuador, but the beans need to be harvested after a full moon, because that's when the flavor is at its peak. She also wanted it baked at the exact temperature of 175 degrees Fahrenheit for 42 minutes. Now, we weren't exactly in the habit of growing or sourcing our own cacao, but I smiled and took the request back to the kitchen. The chef looked at me like I was joking, but we tried our best. When the cake was finally ready, the woman didn't touch it at first. Instead, she sat there, closing her eyes, apparently feeling the cake's energy. After a minute, she took a small bite and said, it's not quite right. It's missing something. It needs more love. At that point, I didn't know what to say. She then told me she couldn't eat the cake until the vibes were aligned. So she spent another 10 minutes rearranging the plates, cutting and placing the cake in a way that represented balance. The strangest part was when she told me that she had once eaten the perfect chocolate cake while meditating at sunrise in a field of lavender, and that this cake had come close to the experience, but it wasn't there yet. She said, next time, just make sure the cake has had the right intention set for it and we'll be good. Story 23. It was the kind of night where everything seemed to go wrong. I was waiting tables at a popular sushi restaurant, and it was packed with customers. A couple walked in, and I showed them to their table. They ordered the usual, sushi rolls, miso soup, and edamame. However, when the sushi arrived, the woman, in the most serious tone, told me she couldn't eat it unless it was placed on a moonlit plate. Confused, I asked her to explain. She said, I need the plate to be touched by the moonlight before the food is served. If the plate is not aligned with the natural rhythms of the Earth's gravitational pull, I will not be able to eat the sushi. It's not a dietary restriction, it's about my energy. I stood there, unsure of what to do. I asked my manager, and we both walked outside with the plate to see if we could catch the moon. Of course, there was no moon that night. The best we could do was stand under the restaurant's outdoor light, which we hoped would be close enough. We brought the plate back inside, and when I served her the sushi, she inspected it carefully. She picked up each piece with her chopsticks, then nodded with satisfaction. Ah yes, this is exactly as it should be. The man at the table didn't seem to mind at all, just calmly enjoying his meal. The woman then turned to me and said, next time, ensure that the plate has been blessed by the moon and all will be well. She finished her meal, left a solid tip, and left with a serene expression on her face. I have no idea how the moonlight truly affects sushi, but it seemed to work for her. Story 24. A regular customer came in one evening, a man who had frequented the restaurant for months and usually kept things simple. Pasta, a salad, maybe a glass of wine. But on this particular night, he surprised me with an order that made me question everything I knew about food. I'd like a bowl of soup, he said, but it needs to be warm, comforting, like a hug, but not too hot, just enough to make the inside of my mouth feel cozy. I nodded, not thinking it was anything strange, and asked him if he had a preference. He went on, but it also must have an undertone of smokiness. I wanted to feel like I'm standing by a campfire, but only the faintest hint. And don't let it be too brothy. I needed to feel thick enough to be satisfying, but not so thick that I can't drink it. Now, I was genuinely perplexed. I went to the kitchen with his request, and the chef raised an eyebrow but agreed to give it a try. We made a smoky vegetable soup, but when I returned with it, the man insisted it wasn't quite there. He told me, the soup is too much like a memory of warmth, but not warmth itself. Could you bring me something with a feeling of nostalgia instead? I returned with a different version of the soup, a little creamier, and this time, it seemed to hit the mark. The man closed his eyes as he took a sip and said, perfect. This soup feels like I'm back in my grandmother's kitchen. Thank you. It wasn't the strangest order I've had, but I've never been so focused on the vibe of a soup. At the end of the meal, he left me a generous tip, and I couldn't help but wonder if every dish has its own emotional resonance. Story 25. I work at a burger joint, and while we get our share of customizations, one customer took it to a whole new level. A man walked in, tall and well-dressed, with a demeanor that made him seem more like a CEO than a casual diner. When he ordered a burger, he asked for the meat to be sourced only from cattle that have been raised on a pasture where the grass is grown in complete silence. I had to stop and ask him to explain. He told me that the cows should only eat grass that has been blessed by the quiet of the earth, untouched by the sounds of civilization. I had no idea how to respond, but after a long conversation, I realized he was referring to a brand of organic, grass-fed beef that his family farmed. So I got the kitchen staff to prepare it with that particular beef. Then, things got even strange. He asked for the burger to be served on a single, unbroken slice of organic sourdough bread, but it couldn't be toasted too much. It had to be warm enough to hold the meat, but soft enough to melt into the burger without making a mess. After everything was assembled, I brought the burger out, and he immediately started examining. The texture of the bread isn't quite right. Can you press it down a little bit, but not too much? Just enough to make it seem as though it's been naturally compressed by the weight of the universe. I did my best to adjust the burger, bringing it back to him, and after a few bites, he nodded. This is it. Thank you. You've understood the essence of the burger. He paid the bill with a thick envelope of cash, and as he left, he told me, "When you know the true nature of a burger, you'll always know what's right." It left me questioning if I should be looking for the cosmic balance in every dish I serve. Story 26. I was working as a server at a high-end restaurant known for its fine wines and exceptional cuisine when a very peculiar customer came in one evening. A woman in her late 40s, dressed in high-end fashion, walked in and made her way to the bar where I was stationed. She ordered a glass of red wine, and when I asked what type, she responded, "It needs to be a vintage from 1987, but it can't be just any 1987. It has to be a Bordeaux, specifically from a vineyard that practiced biodynamic farming." I was taken aback, but I tried my best to accommodate her request. We had a few Bordeaux options on the menu, so I offered one from the year she mentioned. She sipped it and made a face. "This one's too smooth," she said. "I can't drink it. It doesn't have enough texture." You see, wine should have an emotional depth, like the way an old friend's voice sounds. It should hold weight in the mouth. I wasn't sure how to respond, so I brought her a few more bottles of 1987 Bordeaux, hoping one would match her exact taste. After rejecting each one, she sighed and asked, "Could you please open a bottle from 1985? It should be in a similar climate, but just a little warmer. I need the depth to come from the soil. The terroir should feel like a personal connection to the earth." At that point, I went into full problem-solving mode, trying to locate a bottle she would approve of. And finally, after almost an hour, I brought her a bottle of 1985 Bordeaux that seemed to do the trick. "Yes, this is it," she said with a smile. "I can feel the connection between the soil and my soul." As she left, she graciously thanked me and left an incredibly generous tip, though I couldn't help but wonder how a wine could have such a profound emotional connection. It certainly made me think more deeply about what perfect really means in the world of food and drink. Story 27. One of the most surreal requests I've ever had came during a fairly busy shift at a local Italian restaurant. A man, around his 30s, came in with his girlfriend and sat down to order dinner. The two were having a pleasant conversation until the man ordered a plate of pasta. His request was simple enough at first. "I'd like your spaghetti, but I want the noodles cooked al dente, of course." So far, so good. But then, things took a bizarre turn. He looked up at me and said, "And for the sauce, I want it to be made with a unique blend of tomato, basil, and garlic. But it has to be prepared in silence." I had to ask him to repeat himself. "The sauce needs to be made in complete silence," he clarified. "No chatter in the kitchen, no music, no sounds from the outside world. I need the sauce to be pure." I thought this was a joke, but the man's face was serious. I went back to the kitchen and explained his request. And, though confused, the staff agreed to prepare the sauce under these conditions. There was complete silence in the kitchen as the chef and the line cooks worked. I brought the plate of spaghetti out to him, and he inspected the sauce closely. The strangest part? He took a bite, paused, and said, "This isn't quite right. I can taste the energy of the kitchen's environment. Can you please make sure that the next batch is prepared in a different atmosphere?" At this point, I wasn't sure whether he was joking or not. He was utterly serious, though, and I had to inform him that we couldn't really change the environment of the restaurant. He seemed to understand, but he still ate his meal quietly and left without a word. Despite the oddness, he left a generous tip, and I couldn't help but wonder if I was missing something profound in his request. Story 28. I work at a popular seafood restaurant that prides itself on the freshest catch and a very eclectic clientele. One evening, a family of 5 walked in, and the father, who looked like he had some very specific demands, ordered for the group. He asked for the catch of the day, but with an unusual request. "I want the fish filleted, and then the fillets must be gently rubbed with sea salt. Not just any salt, though," he specified. "It needs to be from a particular beach, one that's not too crowded, preferably untouched by human activity." I was stunned, but since we had a few options for specialty salts, I asked him what he had in mind. He replied that he preferred the salt from a specific beach that he himself had visited once. Since I couldn't access this rare salt, I offered him our own special blend of sea salt. He reluctantly agreed but said, "The salt must not only season the fish but enhance its natural flavor. It should feel like a revelation in every bite." Once the fish was prepared, I brought it to his table, and after a very meticulous inspection, he said, "This is good, but it needs a hint of spice. Can you bring me something to drizzle over the fish to awaken it?" I brought him some homemade spicy oil from the kitchen, and he took a few drops. "Perfect," he said after tasting. "But only a few drops, not too much. I want to feel the fire without it consuming the flavor." At that point, I was starting to lose track of the demands, but when the meal finished, he smiled contentedly and left me a substantial tip. As strange as the order was, I couldn't deny that he seemed to experience a deeper connection with his meal than most people. Story 29. One of the most odd requests I received came from a gentleman who had apparently done extensive research into how food should be eaten in the most efficient way. He ordered a simple grilled cheese sandwich, but before I could even bring it to the kitchen, he laid down a series of demands. I need the sandwich to be grilled to perfection, but the bread must be toasted in a very specific way, he explained. It must have a crispness that feels like it was created by a soft breeze, yet sturdy enough to hold the cheese without breaking. I wasn't sure what he meant, but I nodded. And the cheese, he continued. It has to be a mix of Gruyere and sharp cheddar, but melted in layers, with no cheese ever touching the bread. I want the cheese to hover, to float in the sandwich, as though it were suspended in air. This was getting weird. I relayed the request to the kitchen, and the chefs gave me confused looks, but agreed to try. They managed to get the bread just crispy enough and melted the cheese to a near perfection. When I brought it to him, he picked up the sandwich and shook his head. It's not right. The cheese needs to feel as if it's not even there. A weightless experience. After several minutes of revisiting the sandwich, I brought it back to him. And this time, he took a bite, closed his eyes, and said, "Yes, this is exactly the sensation I was looking for. It's like the sandwich and I are one." He paid his bill without a word, leaving a hefty tip. I'm still not sure how I was supposed to interpret that experience, but it certainly made me reconsider what perfect truly means. Story 30. One Saturday night, I had a group of 5 friends come in to celebrate a birthday at our restaurant. They were all in good spirits, but when it came time for dessert, the birthday girl made an unexpected request. "I'd like your chocolate mousse," she said, "but only if it's served with no spoon." When I raised an eyebrow, she explained, "I want to eat it with my hands, but only with the left hand because the right one carries too much energy." At this point, I wasn't sure whether she was joking, but I smiled and agreed to her request. When I went to the kitchen, I told the chef, who seemed just as confused, but we decided to serve the mousse in a small bowl and let her eat it with her left hand, as requested. When the dessert arrived at the table, she looked down at it, then at her friends and said, "Now, make sure the mousse hasn't been touched by anyone else's energy. I need it to be untouched by the outside world until I get to it." I was unsure how to proceed, but she seemed convinced that the mousse had to be completely untouched. After a few moments, she took a bite, closed her eyes, and smiled. "Perfect. This is exactly what I needed. My left hand is my creative hand, and I needed it to feel the mousse, not just taste it." Her friends laughed and joked about the mystical energy of her left hand, but she was serious. They finished their dessert, and she left an enormous tip, as though the mousse had truly changed her life. I never would have thought that something as simple as a chocolate mousse could hold such importance to someone.